Hi, this is Liz Books and my name is Liz, and today I'm going to be talking about my favorite reads of 2020. So 2020 was a year and it kind of sucked, but I did read a lot of good books this year and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Well, I just said that I read a lot of good books this year. I feel like this is the first year that I actually read books that I actually didn't like. Which I don't think it's just because I started reading books that weren't as good quality. I think it's just because I've actually become more aware of the fact that in the past I've been more lenient towards books I didn't like, and if I didn't like it, if it was a decent book, I'd be like, oh, it's 5 stars, it's good, whatever. But now if I read a book that's just doesn't give me that wonderful feeling, I am like, okay, well, it's not a perfect book and I don't have to give every book 5 stars. Because of that, I haven't had as many favorites I think as I have in the past, or maybe I have, I don't know, I haven't counted. 8 books on my list today, and the first couple are more honorable mentions, but the last few are my favorites of 2020. First book on this list is Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This is kind of more of a honorable mention than an actual favorite book of 2020, just because I mainly read this in 2019. I just finished it early 2020, so I couldn't count it on my favorites of 2019, so here it is now. I actually listened to this on audiobook for the most part, and I would listen to it as I fell asleep or on my way back from school. And it was just such a comforting, wonderful read, and I love it so much. And it's just one of those books that I want to read to my children or something like that. It's just so simple but also beautiful, and it's just one of the best books ever, so it's on this list kind of just because it's kind of a half 2019, half 2020 book. The next book on this list is Crescent City. Okay, well, I call it Crescent City just because I feel like that's the name that everyone calls it, but technically it's called House of Earth and Blood. But this is also kind of an honorable mention just because I technically didn't really give this book a full 5 stars. I gave it a 4.5 or something, which is still technically 5 stars. So this book is an adult urban fantasy, so it's set in this world that is not our world. It's still a high fantasy, separate world from ours, but it is modern, so there are fairies and vampires and mermaids and whatever, but in the same world people also use cell phones. It was really fun to see Sarah J Maas kind of move away from the high fantasy to the high fantasy slash urban fantasy, and it was really fun. And this book takes place in Crescent City, and it follows a young woman. Part of the blurb says something super significant that happens within the first 100 pages, but I don't really want to spoil y'all, so if you happen to have not read the blurb yet, honestly I would recommend that you don't read the blurb, just because I feel like it kind of spoils something that would be kind of fun to not know, or not fun, but just it would make this story more just suspenseful if you didn't know before going into it. So it's an urban fantasy, is good. I didn't give this book a full 5 stars just because since it is a first book in a high fantasy series, it does start out a little slow and there's just a lot of world building and it takes a little bit for the story to pick up. But the reason why I'm putting this book on this favorites of 2020 list just because the last third of this book is fantastic. I could not stop reading when I got to page I don't know, 500 or whatever, just because it was just so good, because you could just see how everything, literally every single detail within the first 2/3 of the book, you could see how every detail came back around. It's almost kind of a favorite, kind of an honorable mention. I just wanted to talk about it because I really enjoyed it and I'm excited for the next one. The next book on my list is Island of the World by Michael D. O'Brien. This book is chunky. It is a historical fiction, I would say, and it follows just the story of this man's life. That sounds boring, but I promise it's not. The story really starts out whenever this man is a young boy and he is living in World War II era Yugoslavia, and it just kind of goes from there. I don't really know what else to say about it. It's just really good and really beautifully written. It's definitely not my usual genre I like to read. I'm definitely more of a fantasy person, But this book was amazing. It's probably one of my favorites of all time, not just of 2020. If you haven't read it, it's not well known, but it's really, really good. The next book on my list is Every Last Word by Tamara Ireland Stone. I think I talked about this book in my mid-year book freakout tag video, and I talked about how it was my most surprising read of 2020, and that still stands. I think that this book definitely surprised me the most with how much I liked it. This book follows a girl in high school who has OCD and just how she's dealing with her friends and stuff like that, and it's just really good and has like a lot of emphasis on poetry and words, and it's just such a beautiful book. I loved it so much. I read it so fast. Like, I'm really not like contemporary, YA contemporary type person. I like reading them, but when I do read them, usually they aren't like my favorite books, but this one was so good. I probably wouldn't have picked it up, but my best friend read it and she was like, oh my gosh, it's so good. So I did, and I read it in like a day. So good. If you haven't read it, you probably have read it already, because this book I'm pretty sure came out in like, I don't know, 2015. So it's been a bit, so I'm on the late train with this one, but I'm really glad I picked it up. It's so good. I low-key want to reread it, but we'll get there. The next book on my list is Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. I don't have Rhythm of War in here because I actually haven't read Rhythm of War yet, so maybe it would have been on my favorites of 2020, but if it's gonna be that good, it'll be on my favorites of 2021 list next year. But I read Storm in the Archive this year for the first time, and it was so good. And out of all three of Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, and Oathbringer, Words of Radiance was definitely my favorite. The Storm in the Archive by Brandon Sanderson is a high fantasy series. I literally don't know how to explain it just because I can hardly like explain it to myself. It's just very intricate and just like high fantasy, and it's so good, and the characters are so good. This book in particular was just like, it was just so perfectly paced and plotted, and there were such good moments. Like, I read this book, I was just speeding through it even though it's literally like, I don't know, 1,200 pages or something, but it's so good. This series has definitely been one of my highlights of 2020, and I'm really glad I got to it this year. It's been kind of like in the back of my mind, I was like, oh, I should read that, but this year I finally didn't read it, and I'm excited that I did, and I'm excited to read The Rhythm of War. Hopefully I'll get to that soon, but this series is great. If you haven't picked it up yet, you should. The next book on my list is Instacart by Marissa Meyer. I don't know, Marissa Meyer is my favorite author. Everything she's written has been one of my favorite book or series of all time, and this one is no exception. This one is her first contemporary, so I was like, I don't know, like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know why I like had any sort of doubt because I love all her books. But this one is a YA contemporary, and it follows a very ambitious perfectionist girl, and she ends up getting the ability to like cast instant karma, which honestly for me wasn't really the main part of this story, but like it was a kind of like an overarching thing. And this book was just so cute. Like, it was very summery. I read it it came out in November, and I read it in November, but like it was a very summer book, so I was like, wow, I want it to be summer. It was just so sweet, and there were like sea animals and really, really cute romance, and it was just made my heart like so happy. And I read it so fast, as I always do with her books. This one is just really sweet. If you just need a book just to make you happy and just forget about everything ever, read this. It's so good. Now we're down to the top two. My second favorite book of 2020 is A Heart So Fierce and Broken by Bridget Kemmer. This book, I've reread it twice, actually. I reread it right in the beginning of 2020, and then I just reread it because of House of Blood and Deadly, the third book in the trilogy, is coming out in a month, and I'm really excited. A Heart So Fierce and Broken is the second book in this Cursebreakers trilogy. The first book is A Curse So Dark and Lonely. I kind of wanted to include A Curse So Dark and Lonely on this list too, but I technically read it in 2019. I literally read it December 31st, 2019 in like a day, so I was like, but I just said, you know what, I read it in 2019. Curse of Dark and Lonely is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and by the second book, the retelling aspect of the story has definitely been you know, that part of the story is already over, and in this book, you know, the world has very much become its own, and the story has become its own also. And it's just so good. Like, it's been a bit since I have felt this strongly and deeply about like a new series and like a new author too. Like, I love this book so much. I read it twice this year, and each time I read it within like a day, just because they're so good. Like, she's just so good at storytelling, and it's so fast paced. Not in a bad way, the story is just very quick and fun, and it's so good. I've not read this series yet. I definitely recommend you do. The third one comes out January 28th, I believe, and that's like under Chain of Iron, that's probably my most anticipated read of 2021. Vast of Bold and Deadly is going to be as good as I think it's going to be. This series is definitely going to be like one of my favorite series of all time. So the last book on this list is my favorite book of 2020, and that is Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare. No one is surprised. Chain of Gold is the first book in the Last Hour series by Cassandra Clare. It is a book in the Shadowhunter Chronicles. If you don't know what that is, like the Mortal Instruments, Infernal Devices, Dark Artifices, you know. The series is set after the events of the Infernal Devices, so this one is set in like early 1900 London. I think it's 1903, and it's perfect. This book, like, I read it right whenever the world got insane. I read it in like early March, and it just stuck with me throughout this entire year. It's just, I always think about it, and it just definitely got me through those like really rough lockdown months. And I reread it too. I think I reread it in like April or something, which is really quick after I read it first in March, which is unusual for me to read something or reread something that soon. Just such a wonderful story, and I loved the characters so much, and I think Cassandra Clare has this ability to make her characters feel really real and just authentic, and that really shone through in this one. And I just loved it so much, and I loved all the characters and the plot, and I just love the setting too. It's just, I have just been like immersed in the world of Shadowhunters this year, because after I finished this book, I was like, well, I'm just gonna reread every book in the Shadowhunter Chronicles, and I did, and it was just a lot of fun, and I really love all these books, especially this one, and I'm so excited for Chain of Iron. Lately, Cassie's been giving us like a bunch of excerpts and stuff like that, and she even, the first 2 chapters of Chain of Iron came out. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you all read some great books in 2020, and I hope that you all read some many, many more great books in 2021 and beyond. Bye! Next book on my favorites of 2020 list is Marissa Meyer by Marissa Meyer by Instant Karma. Yes!